first, we'd like to begin with a video message from the founding editor of the World Happiness Report, Dr. John Helliwell.
Originally, the main purpose of the report was simply to report on the current state of science. In the subsequent dozen years, we've gone much further than that because we have been able to take on a whole lot of special topics and to dig deeper all the time. The report itself has leveraged the invaluable data provided by the Gallup World Poll, letting us dig much deeper. This year's report is focusing on happiness at different ages, different stages of life. How are people doing, the young, the older populations, and those in between? We're doing that not only in our central data-rich chapter, but in 3 special chapters focusing on different stages of life. One is on children, adolescents, and youth, using several different surveys of school-age children and beyond. Then there's a chapter on dementia and how happiness affects the onset and severity of dementia, and how dementia in turn reduces happiness. The 3rd chapter is our first and welcome chance to look at India, the largest country in the world now in terms of population, but we have never yet had a special chapter on it, so it's quite a balanced package of covering the stages of life. One feature of the report, and especially chapter 2, that attracts a lot of attention is the rankings. Well, where do countries rank? This year, once again, Finland is at the top of the rankings, and even if by slightly less of a margin, it's still a clean margin. Where we have had more movement is in the levels from 10 to 20, where we found that United States and Germany, which were 15 and 16 last year, are 23 and 24 this year, dropped right out of the top 20, in part by going down themselves, and in part by what's happening in Eastern Europe, where a number of the countries that were far behind Western Europe in their levels of happiness have been coming up, especially among the young, but at all ages for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And Costa Rica, which had started the survey in the top 20 at position 12, but had gone down in the intervening years, is back up in the top 20 in position 12. And some of these broad trends of changing lives in different parts of the world are showing up in how countries are ranked. People often ask, after you've got a report and people who read the report, what can anybody do to produce better lives? Is this something that's to be read by individuals to help them change their own lives? Is this something to be read by policymakers to let them design new institutions? The answer is both. It's a mistake for people to read this and then ask their governments to fix things, because so many of the lessons that are implicit in the underlying science are that life essentially begins at home, that the local environment, the neighborhood, the workplace, the family, the school are of primary importance in how you think about your life as a whole. What's going on in the national capital or even the world, they're important, but they don't have the same power to influence what you think about your life. And the beauty of that is each of us has the capacity to change.
Wonderful. Wow, isn't it wonderful to see your baby here, right?
And thank you, Karen, for giving us the opportunity to present it to everybody.
My pleasure, our pleasure, actually. Thank you. Jan, let's talk about this year's report, because it's a little bit different, right? And why is it that this year's report is focused on happiness at different stages in life?
Well, Karen, it's because the ranking that everybody talks about and the media reports on really is focused on adults. And for the past few years in the editorial board, we've been hammering home, wait a second, don't child and adolescents also deserve a bit more focus? And am I glad that we've actually put in the effort of not just working with the Gallup data, but 3 other major data sets that Jose and Leonie will talk about, to piece together sort of a state of well-being for child and adolescents in addition to adults, but also looking at the differences with the adults, of course. And I'm glad we did, because as John alluded to, the changes in the ranking, especially in the sub-top, the top 20, where you see Central and Eastern Europe come up, where you see Germany and especially the United States come down and fall out of the top 20, that turns out to be explained principally by the changes that you see amongst the younger generation in these countries. So if you were to look at, for example, our friends in the United States, and just take the young generation, they'd be 63rd in the world. And that's a trend that's been going on for the past decade, that we in the field and you in the media will have also picked up on, or will have seen and experienced in your neighborhoods. But I think this year's report is special because it really shines a big spotlight on the importance of child and adolescent well-being and the fact that it's not going in the right direction. Now, today, there's again been a lot of media, and then you're asking the question, so why is it that these children and adolescents, especially in North America, come down? And there's no smoking gun. There's a collection of things that are happening and that are not going in the right direction. But what I've pushed the journalists this morning with is there's also hope, because if you look at Central and Eastern Europe, it's the mirror image. It's the younger generation that is coming up more strongly in terms of their self-rated quality of life. And that's exciting. So there's hope, and I think we can build on that and learn from places like Lithuania, of all places, who, if you do that same ranking I just referred to you for the United States, where the US would come in 63rd, Lithuania comes on top for the below 30s if you were to rank only the people below 30. And so there are lessons to be learned also from countries and regions in the world where youth are doing well. And that is really the focus, I think, for this year's World's Happiest Report, once we get past these general population rankings.
Amazing. Thank you for explaining that, Jan. And what I love about the report, not only this year, but every year, is not only the ranking, but the research that is in each chapter. So I really encourage you to download the report and to read the actual chapters, because many of you work in well-being, and this is definitely the place to get some very, very rich and valid research to make the case for well-being and find hope. Jose, how does child and adolescent well-being differ from adult well-being? Because we see these differences that Jan is mentioning, and can you shed some light into that?
Sure. There is a short answer to that, which is well-being is higher in children and young people compared to adults, but it needs a bit of explanation. So first of all, just the idea is that as you grow older, you become happier, at least until your 40s or late 40s, and then probably Richard and Jan will talk a little bit more about what happens later in life, but life satisfaction in this case declines from childhood through adolescence and into adulthood. But there are some differences across countries, regions, and groups that are worth noting. So, for example, I think very briefly it's very important to note that we looked into 2 different groups, and we had to study both differently because of data limitations. So we looked into those aged 10 to 15 first, for whom we have nationally representative samples of mainly high-income countries only, mainly from the Western world. And then we also looked into the life satisfaction of those aged 15 to 24 using more global data from over 140 countries from the Gallup World Poll. But in this case, we are not talking about nationally representative samples, but a cut of national representative samples of the population aged 15 to 64. Sorry about the boring stuff. Now moving to the interesting findings. So, we find some gender gap in this decline that happens from childhood through adolescence and into adulthood, but that differs across countries and regions, and also between these age groups. So, for example, we know that a gap emerges at around age 11 or 12, and to the point that when it gets to 15, there is quite already a big gap. Females report lower life satisfaction than males. But we know this from, as I said, mainly high-income countries, mainly in the Western world. And we kind of suspect that this gap does not manifest in the same way in other parts of the world because, for example, when we look to the 15 to 24-year-olds in the more global sample, we find a gap that manifests in the opposite direction, right? So females report higher life satisfaction than male in the global sample, age 15 to 24, which is not observed in high-income countries, right? Which makes us believe or suspect that when we look to other parts of the world, these gender gaps, in this case, might look a bit different. And the second point is that, yes, there is a decline from childhood through adolescence and into adulthood. And this decline seems to be more pronounced or severe in lower-income countries. So we do have data from a few middle and low-income countries, and we see that, yes, it seems that when life gets tougher, a bit tougher when you go into adulthood, it seems it gets much tougher for those living in lower-income countries. A third important point, I think, is that this decline is not linear. You see some parts of the world, some countries, life satisfaction really goes to the lowest point at around age 15. All this considering the limitations of the data that I just mentioned, but it seems that, for example, in Western Europe, life satisfaction declines from age 10, 11 to 12, 13, 15, and we don't see that life satisfaction across, among those age 15 to 24 is lower. It doesn't go any lower in Western Europe. And actually, in some countries, sadly in the UK, and in some other countries, I think it's Sweden, Iceland, Ireland, we find that the life satisfaction of those aged 15 to 24 is actually higher than among those aged 15. So I think this kind of speaks a bit of the magnitude of the crisis that adolescents are going through at age 14, 15, 16 in some countries like the UK. And the fourth and final point, I think something interesting is that the data shows a dynamic picture, right? So we see that things have been changing over the last 15 years. So this gap that we've talked about, so younger people reporting higher well-being than older people or people above 25 years of age is narrowing in Western Europe because of these declining trends in youth well-being in young people in Western Europe. And we find, again, keeping in mind the limitations of the data that we have to work with, we find that in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, this gap might be reversing, right? So young people are no longer reporting higher life satisfaction than older people or people above 25 years of age in these parts of the world. And I think this is interesting because we see in the data that 15 years ago, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe were the happiest regions in the world. 15 years, and I'd say by quite a big difference. 15 years ago, this only applies to those above 25 years of age, and this is no longer the case for younger people. As Jan mentioned, life satisfaction well-being has been increasing in Central and Eastern Europe, for example, and life satisfaction for young people is no longer higher in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe, for example, or even Latin America and the Caribbean. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Jose. That's very enlightening. And what, my brain goes into why and how can we fix it? That's what I think about immediately. And really, there's a huge call to action being found in this report. Very, very important. Leonie, to follow this, what is needed to improve research for well-being research for children and adolescents?
So first, I think I'd like to really celebrate the advancements made in the last 15 years in the field of child and adolescent well-being, science, and data collection.
Is there a microphone?
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. I think first I'd like to celebrate the huge advancements made in the child and adolescent wellbeing science field, particularly with the data providers that we look at in our chapter. I think we need to unfortunately call back to the age-old conundrum of researchers wanting more research, and specifically we'd really like more internationally representative, comparable and longitudinal data. And we can do this a number of ways. I think we would like, as Jose mentioned, a lot of the global data is focused on Western industrialized countries. We'd like more data sets from lower income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We have some brilliant graphs and figures in our chapter to help illustrate the disparities there. We'd like more data on early to middle adolescents. And most importantly, I think longitudinal data. So that means looking at child well-being and tracking them through childhood, adolescence, into adulthood, and really exploring how well-being changes and looking at children throughout their development. I think that's really important. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Leonie. Richard, what can generational well-being analysis do to help inform policy?
Well, I think that social media are a massive problem. If you look at the use of social media, as we know, it shot up from 2010. If you look at the time series of depression in the US and other countries, it shot up from 2000. That doesn't prove causation, but there have been about a dozen controlled trials where some of the participants have stopped using Facebook and others haven't. And in the great majority of these trials, people who stopped using Facebook became significantly happier. So I think that the case is pretty strong. And of course, if you just think about it, what the social media do is they invite you to put your best face forward, to show off as best you can to your peers, and your peers watch it and they compare your best with their average and they feel inferior. So there's this horrible, undesirable competitive element introduced into our lives. It's always there, but this is being exacerbated. What can be done? We've had a young teenager murdered. She was trans, but she was murdered by two other teenagers who had been put up to it, essentially, by murderous material on social media. And she's campaigning for a ban on social media under the age of 16. And that sounds to me a pretty good idea. Now, Vivek talked about this yesterday, and we just have to realize that technology has good things and bad things. The car in Britain in 1930, 7,000 people were killed by cars in Britain. Now it's 2,000. So that shows what you can achieve by regulating something which has its good parts and its bad parts. Many other things I want. I want, of course, better mental health services for young people. In Britain, it's extraordinary that unless the child is more or less threatening to kill his sibling or him or herself, they can't get therapy except in 1/3 of the country. This policy called mental health support teams in schools is going so slowly. I want that to be in everybody's election manifesto for every child in Britain. I also want a proper system for giving skills to people who don't go to university. At the moment, if you go to university, it's easy, you can see how it works. If you're qualified, you can expect to find a place. If you're qualified for an apprenticeship, you can't expect to find a place. It's a lottery. That's got to change, and I want every platform in every election manifesto to promise guaranteed access to apprenticeship for every young person. I want to say one other thing, because I think the most important thing I've heard at this conference was said by Arthur Brooks yesterday morning, which is that actually, if these problems are to be solved, we all have to be missionaries. I mean, it's wonderful, we're a massive group here, but we are actually a minority. And it takes for everybody to have the courage to speak up and to make the case for well-being, for us to become the majority. So let's put well-being first.
Absolutely, hear, hear. Jan.
Just a quick follow-up, because Richard has a long list, but he omitted one program, and he's being very modest because it's a program that he actually came up with. It's called Healthy Minds, and it's a life skills project and program within school curricula. Because right now, all of our high school, secondary, primary, secondary school, we're all teaching to the test, STEM, and it's awfully important, but it's not all there is to life. And so Richard introduced a more holistic element into a curriculum called Healthy Minds, and that showed and made sure that students over time became more balanced, higher levels of global health and well-being, and also, we're hopefully going to find out, actually do better on the test in the first place.
Amazing. Maybe you can do one of your, Jan, one of your research, like what you did with the stock market and how it performs with happier employees, and you found that that happier employees produce better. So it would be interesting to see that.
It's true. We oftentimes hear from more skeptical people, not in this room, talking about, oh, but it's a trade-off. If we invest in well-being, or we open up space on the school curriculum for a Healthy Minds program, God forbid, life skills, then that will come at the cost of our SAT scores, or our GCSEs, or A-levels, or whatever it's called. Same thing in business, investing in workplace well-being. Oh, it costs money, and then, God forbid, they'll take 50 minutes away for some, what was it, Pilates, we heard Sarah say. Well, guess what? Guess what? That 50 minutes taken out of the day may improve the productivity of the remainder of the day. So it doesn't have to be a trade-off. It can be a win-win. And that is so important to show. And it's researchers like Richard, myself, in a context of workplace well-being. We have to be able to show that there is no trade-offs. It's win-wins.
Absolutely. That requires a mindset shift. And so I'm really happy that we have the data to then support that, advocacy that we're also adamant about. I wonder if Leonie or Jose could answer, I'm a strengths approach type of person. And so I'd love to see if you can shed some light into what's going right in like Eastern Europe. What did you find? Is there anything that you found that we can grow upon?
No. Yeah. We didn't go into that level of detail. There wasn't room in the chapter for that. And we really don't know. I think there's something interesting in we talk a lot about social media, but I would assume that young people in Eastern Europe are using social media as much as young people in Western Europe. Why is it then that well-being is increasing in Eastern Europe and not in Western Europe? Maybe it's not, most likely it's not all about social media. I know we are concerned, and we have very good reasons to be concerned about that. But I think we shouldn't be focusing exclusively on social media. I mean, we know that that's not the only reason. But yes, we didn't go in that much level of detail. Hopefully in the future we can do that.
I think in relation to your strengths-based approach and building on Jose's, I think we really need to emphasize the power of schools in child well-being. We really view that schools should be considered essential, a focal point for data collection on child well-being. But we know that there are many teachers here today, but the teachers are massively, massively overworked and underpaid. And it's our responsibility as researchers to support schools in that process of data collection. And I think schools are just a very essential part to improving well-being across childhood and adolescence.
Can I just... there have been now over 200 studies of interventions to promote well-being in schools, and they have checked what is the effect of the well-being course, not only on well-being, but on achievement. And the effect on achievement is actually as big as it is on well-being. This is Derlek et al., 2011. Please quote it to anybody who says the contrary.
I think that's, that's what we need to all put in our pockets when they want to take away, what is it, recess in the United States? I don't know, yeah, art, socializing, letting children, kind of be children and connect with each other, like Dr. Murthy was talking about yesterday. And if you can shed a little bit also about the older generations, was there anything that you found that was interesting or you can share with us that was new in this report?
Well, maybe I can emphasize, so in the science of well-being, and all of you will be familiar with this, there's this U-shaped relationship between age and well-being. And I think what's really exciting in this report, having pieced together the biggest data sets we could put our hands on, is that it's a lot more dynamic than we think on that front. And yes, actually one of the insights for me personally was the very early stage levels of well-being, 10, 11, 12-year-olds that we've gotten our hands on the data for, they start out so happy. There's countries where, it'll be 8.5, 9 out of 10 in terms of self-reported life satisfaction. And these, we're talking kids 10, 11, 12. And quickly, unfortunately, they slide down that U-shape, that U-curve, into midlife crisis and then back up. Now, typically, we see sort of a U-shape, but as Karen already sort of alluded to, and we've been talking about, in some countries, and most notably the United States, that U-shape is no longer there. The first half of the U is completely fallen down, is now reversed. So as Jose eloquently put it, youth are less happy than the adults in the United States today. So figure out or think about what that means for the future, because they're essentially experiencing their midlife crisis today. So you can imagine where they'll be when the actual midlife crisis hits, or can try and imagine. Now on the elderly, or 60 plus, later in life, that has been slightly more stable, especially in the US. So when I said that if you look at the below 30s, the US would be 63rd in ranking. If you were to just look at the top, 60 and above years of age, they'd still be 10th in the world. And so there's this, we talk about inequality in terms of income and wealth. In our field, we now also start talking about well-being or happiness inequalities. But there's these intergenerational inequalities that are sort of coming to the fore as well. And I think especially in North America and to some extent Western Europe and Britain, you see sort of these intergenerational differences between well-being really cropping up. So how can it be that in a society, part of it is essentially the 10th in the world and the other part is the 63rd in the world? That raises massive questions, and I think that's never been quite the case as much. So you wouldn't expect that normally, if you've got a nice U-curve across the world, systematic, you'd expect the below 30s to be, say, 20th in the world, the middle-aged 20th in the world, and then the seniors about 60, 20th in the world. And yet we've got these massive differeces. One country, we were asked about it this morning, the news, the Portuguese media was interested. There's an opposite effect happening, just like in Eastern Europe as well, where you essentially see the older age not as happy as they could be, and the younger populations, like in Eastern Europe, also being punching a bit above their weight, relatively speaking. So there's interesting dynamics in that general sort of U-shape.
Probably one of the most fascinating points is this discovery of this intergenerational well-being discrepancy, right? Because it didn't happen overnight, so it's been happening under our noses. And it's so great to have your work to identify that, because we definitely need to go into further study, because I think, like the gentleman who founded Jean Couture was saying earlier today, that when we talk to kids and we say that they're the future, we have to, for them it's now. It's not about the future, it's about their now. And so I think that's so important in this year's report to talk about youth well-being now.
If I can quickly comment, and obviously I think I'm speaking on all our behalf, and also all our behalf, literally, we have to focus on child and adolescent well-being because they have a long life ahead of them. And Richard has an amazing book that looks at well-being across the life course, and it focuses in on data on mental health and well-being of young people. And lo and behold, no surprise, duh, it's the biggest predictor of how you feel later in life is how you feel as a child, and your life outcomes. So I'm proud of an early paper way back in 2012 that Andrew Oswald and I wrote, where we showed and have data from 15,000 adolescents in America. It's called the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. They've tracked the same 15,000 youth when they were starting at the age of 12, this was in the early 90s, all the way through into their 30s when they're sort of adults in the labor market. And what we found is that adolescent well-being, so this is 14, 16, 18, 21 years age, their levels of well-being, their life satisfaction, the experience of positive emotions was an extraordinary predictor of their later earnings in life when they were 30 and above. So people experiencing better childhood well-being were doing better in the labor market subsequently. So there's real-life consequences of how people feel today, and it feeds through a number of channels that we can talk about at some other point.
Richard.
I'd like to add to that. I mean, one of the things which really amazed me in this study was that if you are looking at what are the factors which are affecting a child's well-being at 16, the school is having as much of an effect as everything that we know about the parent. So the idea that schools, you know, the job of the school is to do the academic thing because they're not equipped to do the other thing. They are doing it. They are having a huge effect. The variation between and the happiness of children in different schools, holding constant the background, is extraordinary. And the even more extraordinary thing is that you can actually measure the effect of a primary teacher that a child had for 1 year at age 8. And you can see how that affects whether they went to university what they achieved as an adult. This is completely extraordinary. So teachers, you're in the forefront. You really are.
Absolutely. And we need to take care of our teachers, right? Because I think that the beginning of the children's well-being at school are the teachers. So that's so incredibly important. Leonie or Jose, do you want to add something in closing? Is that Jose? John?
Well, in closing, we want to thank the partners of the World Happiness Report, because this thing doesn't come about by its own. And every year, it's a huge, huge effort. And it's an army of extraordinary researchers from around the world that come together around the theme from different universities around the world. The editorial board, we meet every Thursday afternoon throughout the year, working on this and preparing. In fact, next week, we're already thinking about the next one. And so keep an eye out, because one thing that we'll be innovating with is, and I know there's a lot of scholars and researchers in the room, we're going to post a call for chapter proposals from now on, and that'll hopefully be exciting. But the World Happiness Report is an extraordinary partnership with a whole host of stakeholders that make it possible. And I don't want to leave this stage without saying thank you to some of our sponsors that made it possible: the research support, the production, and the dissemination of the report. And those, we've got some amazing new sponsors from Japan, Ezaki Guliko, and especially Katsuhiko Foundation. And I know there's some representatives here in the room with us today, all the way from Japan, which is amazing. Thank you. We've also found an extraordinary partner and sponsorship in Blue Zones that you'll be familiar with from the Netflix documentary. And then we've continued to rely on our friends at Illy Coffee, who have been with us from the very beginning, supporting this line of research. So thank you to all of them. And then finally, the data underpinning the ranking is the Gallup World Poll. So we owe a huge, major thanks to the Gallup organization. And in the last minute of us being on stage, you're going to hear from the CEO, John Clifton himself, sharing a message with you.
What is the happiest place on earth? Thanks to the World Happiness Report, we now know the answer. And thanks to Oxford University and the United Nations, this work has become famous. But what many don't know is that the voices behind it come from a global study conducted by Gallup. Our interest in happiness traces back many decades. Our founder, George Gallup, is best known as the pioneer of modern polling and the inventor of presidential approval ratings. But his insatiable curiosity took him beyond the political realm. In an interview with the esteemed journalist Edward R. Murrow in the 1950s, Dr. Gallup was asked, of everything that you've studied, what is it that interests you the most? His answer? Happiness. We've since put booster rockets on his original work and began studying happiness, well-being, and the essence of a great life across 140 countries. And to date, Gallup has surveyed more than 3 million adults in over 168 countries using more than 150 languages. Understanding the statistical landscape of life on Earth serves a critical purpose beyond mere curiosity. The absence of such data can have dire implications. Effective policymaking relies on solid data, yet there remains a significant lack of it in various parts of the world. Many of the existing global indicators, like GDP, only capture the economic dimensions of life, if at all. Today's World Happiness Report attempts to bridge some of these gaps by offering insights into people's perceptions of life on Earth. It offers more than just national rankings. It provides analytics and advice for evidence-based planning and policymaking. Our role in research on world happiness is a natural fit with our long-standing mission, providing leaders with the right information about what people say makes life worthwhile.
Thank you, and thank you to our very distinguished panel.